My name is Lauren Longmire, and I am the director of, director of regional enhancement. That was my old title for the Knoxville Chamber. I really appreciate everyone joining us today. I know some of you may have already joined this event that we had. I believe it was back in May, ahead of the first change. We appreciate you joining us again as the next iteration of this rule change happens in January. So joining us today, we have Chris McCarty, who is an attorney with Lewis Thomason. Then we also have Julie Simpson, Vice President of Human Resources at UT Medical Center, and Sarah Alexander, Director of Talent Development with LHP Capital. And we thank you all for taking time out of your all's busy schedule to join us today and help everyone on the call really understand what these changes mean for them. So if you're on the call, you probably know a little bit about what's going on. But in case you don't, the Department of Labor had a final rule announced earlier this year that decided that salary thresholds for overtime exemptions under the Fair Labor Standards Act would increase in July of this year, which it did, and then in January of 2025. Once the new rule for January takes effect on January 1st, employees earning less than $58,656 annually will lose their overtime exempt status. Because of that, employers must either raise these employees' salaries to maintain their exempt status or reclassify their positions as non-exempt, paying them an hourly wage with overtime where applicable. So our panelists today are well equipped to help us understand and feel confident in how our businesses are responding to these new rules. Before we get started, I do want to say a quick thank you to our regional enhancement partner, Cirrus Aircraft, and our talent ecosystem partners, Accenture, REMX, and Y12 Federal Credit Union for making today's program possible. Okay, so let's get started. Our first question, what are some challenges employers have experienced as they worked to meet July's requirements? Julie, do you want to start with this one? Did you all have any challenges as one of our area's largest employers?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. The July change was not as big of a leap for us as the January one is going to be. If you look at our population, we're almost 6,000 team members that are employed directly by UT Medical Center. Of course, if you add our partners, that number goes up to 7,000. But the number for the first jump in July, that was a very small population for us, and so it made it easier for us to work directly with the managers, let them know about the change, let them know why the change was happening, and then be able to evaluate each of those situations on a case-by-case basis. So it was less than, I would say, 20 people. And if you think about our population, we have 74% of our team members who are classified as non-exempt and are clocking either using a physical time clock, using the mobile app or the desktop app to record their time. So it was that was a very small number, but there's lots going into this new rule for January 1, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So not as big of a lift for us, but something certainly that we worked closely with those managers, giving them talking points for those implementations.
Thank you, Julie. That's a great suggestion to provide the managers with the talking points so they know how to communicate that. Sarah, did you have any clients that you worked with that there were some challenges?
And as many of us on this call today know, this started back in 2015, 2016. And so this has been on the radar a while. So prior to my role here at LHP Capital, I was in a capacity as an independent HR consultant, working primarily with small to medium-sized businesses in our area. So with that said, they have, faced some unique challenges with this over the course of those years. Typically, it starts with, where do I start, right? What do I do here? And so, we start with the analysis. Well, let's take a look at, the easiest thing is pull up your salaries. Who's not meeting the salaries test to begin with. And then from there, we got to take a look at the job duties test. I know we focus primarily on the number here, but, we can't forget those duties tests as well, because that factors in. And so we start with the analysis component. And then we say, okay, what can we realistically do? Increasing salaries for a small business, that's a huge impact to the business. So a lot of times what my clients have found to be true for them is that they cannot do that. And so, I have to talk them through, how do we have conversations with these individuals that we've got to change the nature of how they track their time. We got to focus on what actually the impact of this person is. Let's not get stuck in the mud and the mire of, because I think, the impression sometimes is this a demotion. There's a lot of emotions that can come into this. And it's like, we need you to continue to operate in the capacity that you are. It's just, really the biggest thing is just how you're tracking your time, and ultimately that you're going to be paid for every hour that you work. So ultimately could end up, you're getting paid more if you're working overtime hours. But in the cases where they, say, hey, yes, we can bump this individual's pay. And again, this one in July wasn't, as Julie mentioned, quite as big of a leap as the one in January is going to be. So we've had some clients that have done that. But then comes, for the ones, let me backtrack just a little bit. So for the ones that can't make that change in pay, the thing that they're also tasked with is, okay, well, how do I do that? I've only had, 5 to 10 employees so far, and everybody's been classified exempt, and I haven't had to do payroll. And so they have to figure that out, in terms of what kind of payroll system do I need to implement, and/or personnel do I need to either tap somebody within my organization already or someone external to actually perform the payroll functions. Because realistically, our, business owners don't probably have that time, that capacity to add that additional thing to their plate. So with the two buckets of employees, the ones that they, are changing the salaries and the ones that they're not, the next thing is the communication piece. So Julie touched on that. You can't just do this and not tell people what you're doing. And so you can do that through group meetings. You can do that through one-on-one meetings. It just kind of depends on how emotional you think this communication might be and how big your staff is too. I mean, realistically, if you have 100 some people, you probably can't meet with each person individually initially to do that. But ultimately, if you do have people, there are, some people that stand out and say, I really have questions about this. Yes, do have those one-on-one conversations. Don't miss that opportunity to have, answer questions, just be, give them an opportunity to be heard. And then another thing that kind of gets left off is training, especially for the people that get their salary bump. That's probably not, they're just going to business as usual. But the people that, are going to have to start tracking their time, likely these folks haven't done that in a while. The last time I tracked my time was all the way, my first job after college, I was even tracking my time. That's been many years ago now, not to tell my age. So, teach them how to do it, but also help them create the habit, because it's just going to be a new thing that they're just not used to doing. And we can get into the intricacies of that later, but that, I'm just going to wrap this up real quick so we give Chris a chance to talk too. But those are the things, the primary challenges that I've seen with some of our small to medium-sized businesses.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. Chris, what about you? You have anything?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say two challenges that I've seen the most is one's like a misconception, and it's a misconception, and Sarah sort of touched on it, where a lot of employers and a lot of supervisors assume that they've always heard about the duties test. We've as HR people and as employment lawyers, we've been preaching the duties test for years, and the duties test is important. But what a lot of people didn't understand until this hit the proverbial fan this year is the duties test comes second, right? I mean, unless you've made the salary threshold, unless you have a specific exemption like teachers do, for example, you can't even get to the duties test unless you're making that minimum weekly amount, right? So that's one, is getting people to understand they've got to meet the salary first, and then we can talk about duties. Then the second thing, and Sarah also touched on this, but I'll expand on it just a little bit, is not only getting the employee themselves, who might have to shift to an hourly employee to a non-exempt employee. That's about messaging and training, and I totally agree with what Sarah and Julie were saying there. And I also just add to it, it's also about getting those supervisors to understand not only do you have to track the employee's time, but the way in which you use that employee is going to have to change. So, for example, if you're used to having, that person out of college that was entry level and they're exempt, and you're used to sending them an email at 8 p.m. at night that says, hey, can you jump on the computer and help me figure something out? Now that's on the clock. If you're used to calling them in for a Saturday and saying, hey, come help me with a big project from 8 a.m. to 12, that's on the clock. And that's going to not only be on the clock, that's going to be a time and a half. And so those managers just understanding, hey, you're not going to be able to use that person as much unless you're getting authorization from the employer to all of a sudden we have a big budget item that's coming out that we weren't prepared for previously.
Thank you. That's a great point, Chris. In a previous job I had many years ago during college, I can remember those conversations of someone telling a manager, I didn't approve your staff's overtime. You shouldn't have allowed that. So that having to think back to that in those days, that's a great point. Thank you. I'm going to backtrack for just a second. I should have mentioned we do have a Q&A. We will do Q&A at the end, but if you think of a question as we're talking, please feel free to go ahead and put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to it at the end. One thing I do want to mention is please know that these questions we hope should be broad and not specific to your particular role or position. These wonderful folks have gifted their time to us today. We want to make sure that the questions asked help multiple people. But if you want to contact one of them and perhaps use their services, particularly Chris, afterwards, we can connect you with him. But just want to say that real quick. Okay, so our next question. What are some strategies to effectively implement changes without overhauling operations? So I think we've touched on this a little bit already, but let's go maybe just into some specifics a little bit. Julie, you want to start?
Yeah, I think that this rule actually had a bit of a silver lining to it, because I think it helps all businesses to step back and just kind of look at things. Maybe you have a job classification, or maybe one or two job classifications where it tends to be kind of a catch-all for people that and that the very first person that went in that job was exempt, and now everybody that's in that job is exempt. And maybe that's not really the way they should be classified. Chris had just touched on that a minute ago with the duties test, but maybe that was just the easy way to do that. So I think for organizations, and specifically mine, it's given us an opportunity to look at those and to go back to those job descriptions and to say, is this really what this person is doing? Maybe they're not even classified appropriately. But I think for us, just taking some small steps, taking some baby steps, whether you're doing a pilot to have some type of an incremental change. Maybe you're doing something with process improvement, whether it be some type of value stream mapping, to look at the department, to look at the role. And then also, as Sarah mentioned just a minute ago, the training is so very important. That training and education about the why are we doing this? Why is this important now? Why is this important for us to do periodically so that we don't become stale and we make sure that we are in compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act, as well as any other regulatory requirements that we have there. So I think that it can initially be for businesses, wow, we just need to move everybody to that new salary, but that may not necessarily be the case. So I think this is actually a good time to have a checkup with some of your job descriptions, some of your classifications, that not everybody has a full comp team to look at this each and every day. I mean, we're all busy, but it's something that it's a checkup for us to do around the subject of compliance, fairness, transparency, and equity.
Great point, Julie. Sometimes those job descriptions, they can be fairly old, right? And so this is a good opportunity to take to review those. Sarah, what about you?
All great points. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to come up with something on top of that. She really covered it. But so again, for the small to medium sized business, I think that, and I've worked in that small business before too. Went from a corporate banking position down to, a locally owned business that we only had 7 people when I started. So it's very operationally very different, wearing lots of hats, and that's where you talk about the job definition. So I think cleaning things up has been a good thing here. And so that's kind of what came to mind as Julie was talking, is the definitions of the jobs, I think actually in the long term can be really helpful, both to the owner or the manager, the leader. I mean, this goes for any size organization, but also the employee, because I think, they kind of, as they work and they do more things and get their hands dirty and stuff, they kind of start to wonder, what is my job? And so they like that definition too. But I also think a really important part of this is boundaries. I think, again, especially with remote work and things like that, those lines have been blurred. And I definitely think that's something that needs to be cleaned up, and thought about, am I appropriately asking for this work at an appropriate time? And things like that. So it makes us think about that, what is the job? Is it appropriate for me to be asking this of that person? And, if they are doing it, should they be paid for it? Because, thinking about kind of why they did this to begin with is, what was Chris, you can help me with this. I think when we originally started this back in 2016, like the salary threshold was very low, absurdly low. And so when you thought about, okay, that person, potentially a person that was in that role may have been misclassified and being paid at a very low rate, could have been getting down. I mean, their effective hourly rate, if they're working 50, 60 hours a week, could have been really close or below minimum wage. So again, just and that's the things that we need to communicate to our employees, that why that Julie talked about. So, my takeaway from this is that definition and those boundaries, creating more healthy boundaries.
Yeah, Chris, I saw you shaking your head a lot with one of the points Sarah made, those boundaries. And, as we're talking about not having to overhaul the entire system, but how do we make sure that we are being equitable and fair across the organization? Chris, you got anything to add about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And they made such great points. I mean, the thing I would say about boundaries is sort of what we are getting at a second ago, that it just goes back to, it's so important to focus, like we talked about, on the employee themselves, who's going to change from an exempt to non-exempt. But I can't say it enough, and that's sort of where Sarah's going, I believe, with the boundaries thing. None of this is going to work unless the supervisors for those employees really understand their behavior has to change, probably just as much, if not more so. And that might even sometimes, man, I've got clients, for example, that are playing around with IT changes. So, for example, literally, if you have a non-exempt employee that used to be exempt, we're just going to turn off their email. It's not going to load from 5 p.m. at night until 8 a.m. the next morning, right? And that way they're not getting the email. We don't have to worry about that supervisor not listening to us and just sending them emails at midnight. It's just not literally going to load. So that employee who now would be on overtime is not going to see that stuff. Or it might even be, hey, we're going to put a new policy in that if you have a non-exempt employee and you want to use them for overtime, it better get booked. And that means also texting them at night. That means calling them at night. And if we hear you as a supervisor are doing those things, there's going to be probably some consequences to you too. The other thing I would add to is sort of what Julie was talking about. They're making such great points. I'm just going to just springboard every time because they're doing the job. I can't say enough about job descriptions. I know that seems like overkill, but I'm telling you, if you've ever had an EEOC charge, if you've ever been in a lawsuit, you ever had a workers' comp claim, and I don't care if it's ADA, DOL, whoever it is, the first thing they're going to ask you for are job descriptions. So if your job description was written on a typewriter, you got a problem. We need to fix that.
That made me laugh. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so our next question, how have you seen this communicated well from employers to employees, which we've really touched on fairly well. But a sub question to that is, have you seen these changes affect morale, which I think is a good point for us to touch on. Sarah, you want to start with that one?
So yes, it can. I think it starts with having a plan for our communication and those talking points that Julie talked about. I think we've all talked about. And communicating the why, helping people understand why this is happening. And okay, first of all, why the government's done this, but also, why we've made the decision that we've made as an organization, right? Why we're not able to boost salaries or why we are for some and not for others. But beyond what we communicate, there's only so much we can control about that, about the way that it's received. And so that's why I, brought up potentially after you have, your in mass meetings, you might have to meet with some folks one-on-one. You might feel that they still have some unanswered questions or just feel unsettled about it. And maybe they just want to be heard and they can't necessarily vet that out in a group setting. So give them that chance, meet with them one-on-one, try to just answer any questions, let them have their time. But yeah, just, realistically, yes, this can have an impact on morale, but that's why we have to be a little bit more diligent about how we initiate and our proactivity in this regard and getting the right message out.
Thank you, Sarah. Julie, I know you said this first iteration there didn't have as much of an impact on your staff, but still interested to hear if you had any effects in morale, and then if you're doing anything proactively to keep morale high for the January change.
So we did not have anything negatively that impacted. Again, it was a small group of people, and so we were really able to have a high touch point with managers. Sometimes having more than one conversation, multiple conversations, circling back around with them to find out what the team member said, what those concerns were, and helping to provide support to the managers. We did an FAQ so that the manager would have that, and I also think that that's helpful for the consistency in the communication. I think there is a rule of thumb. You need to tell people sometimes 7 times before people remember it or before they get it. But we didn't necessarily have anything. We didn't have anything for the July. So for the January, we have just continually been planting the seed because, of course, as late as Friday, there were still some challenges that were going on, but we were planning for that. We also have been looking at that from a budgeting standpoint. We're on a calendar year budget here, so we've been finalizing our budget, going ahead and making those plans for preparation for the worst case scenario for our 2025 budget, letting managers know that. But I think that one of the key things is just to continually put that in front of managers, to let them know that this is coming, to let them know that we're talking with them, we're planning with them, working on those groups that have maybe more of the larger impact, but letting them know what those options are. I think that there might be some folks that might feel, and Sarah had mentioned this a moment ago, is that I haven't clocked my hours. I haven't recorded my hours in 20 years. Am I being demoted, in that? Or maybe, hey, I really have been exempt all this time and I get worked a lot. I feel overworked. So actually moving me to the non-exempt where I'm getting paid for every hour worked, that actually might be a boost in morale. I just think that, again, as Sarah's already mentioned and Chris has mentioned as well, is that keeping those lines of communication open so that you feel like every question is getting answered, and that people don't feel singled out, that this is a compliance issue that the organization must comply with. And I just think that's important to continually keep that feedback happening, and preparing your managers for those conversations.
Thank you, guys. Chris, you are welcome to answer the morale question, but additionally, I'd really like to hear from you. As this is communicated, is there any buzzwords that everybody should stay away from in the communication, or that we want to make sure that we are saying?
Yeah. So I don't know if first I'll go with the morale real quick, Lauren. And the only thing I was going to add to that is just don't forget about what I call up the line morale issues that are going to occur 6 months later to a year later. And what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, you're an employer, because there's going to be some employers that basically just say, hey, look, for all the time and money that I'm going to have to put into tracking this, if I've got somebody at 54 or 53, it might just make more sense to bump them to 58, right? Because of all just the admin time and everything and the risk and the liability that comes with it. The problem with that is we all know that millennials talk more than anybody, and I know I'm not a millennial, about their salaries and about how much they make more than any other generation has. We also know it's illegal to tell them they can't. So where I'm going with that is, if you have that younger employee that's telling everybody, hey, I just got a raise or $5,000, then you got the person that was in that job 10 years ago that says, wait a minute, I was doing that job for 45, and now that person's making almost what I'm making. I want to raise too. And so it's this domino effect of morale that this can have as well that you got to think through before you just say, I'm going to bump somebody up. Because there's anytime you bump somebody, we all know those people in front of them are going to want to bump as well. Right. And as to buzzwords, the biggest thing that I say, and really this kind of goes off what something Julie said earlier, it's not necessarily buzzwords to avoid, it's consistency. And I can't say that enough, that you don't need to be doing this. And I think Sarah mentioned this too, one-on-one. I want there to be no confusion. If somebody's in a certain job category, I want everybody to understand this applies to them. I want everybody to understand these changes are not just happening to you. These changes are happening to everybody in everybody's job category. And again, it always goes back to kind of job descriptions and making sure we all understand what people are doing.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, I'm going to stay with you. I know we need to respect confidentiality, but do you have an example of a business across the country that you've read about, whatever, that has faced penalties in this area?
Oh, I've got lots of examples. And what I would say to that is I probably won't give a specific one because you hit on it, Lauren. I've always got, lawyers, everybody gets tired of our disclaimers. But I will say this. It is I promise you, if you guys have heard me talk about other acts, I don't always say this. The FLSA is the scariest act to get wrong. And there's two big reasons for that. One, because it's economy of scale. I've had clients who have had an FLSA issue. This is not classification, but give you an example, just like a duty-free lunch issue, right? Where they're actually telling people, hey, we're going to guarantee you 8 hours a day, but it's actually 7.5 we're going to pay you for because we're going to assume you're going to take your duty-free lunch. But in reality, we find out that 30 of those people in that one category are never getting lunch. They're always being asked to work. And therefore, if you go back, just take that 30 minutes and this take their hourly rate times 30, times 5 days a week, times a year, times 2 years, all of a sudden, even on a 30-minute window that you're messing up, you're looking at easy 6 figures exposure, right? Because remember, FLSA can go back automatically too. And if it's a willful violation, it goes back 3 years. And when DOL comes in, they don't just look at one employee. One employee might make the complaint, but they look at everybody. They look at everybody across that job category and really everybody close to that job category. So it's that economy of scale that's scary. And the other thing that's scary, there's no insurance people on here, they might correct me. I've yet to see an insurance policy that covers FLSA claims. We have EPL insurance, which is employment practices liability. Guys, that's going to cover your sexual harassment claims, your ADA claims, retaliation claims. It does not cover wage and hour. You're going to see that's carved out of almost every EPL policy. So bottom line is, if you get hit for these penalties, it's coming out of your mainline budget. It's not coming out of an insurance policy. And so are the attorney's fees. So with that, I mean, it really is a scary act.
Chris, just going back to what you said about when they come in, they're going to look at everybody, not just the person who made the complaint. How exactly are the audits structured?
Sure.
And then what are they looking for? Are they going to look through all the details of timesheets and everything?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to give an advertisement for DOL for a second, which nobody expected today. But don't forget, I mean, DOL has offices all over the country. Here in Knoxville, in the John J. Duncan building, I think is where they still are. There's full-time investigators for the Federal Department of Labor. That's all they do. All they do are handle complaints that somebody can get online on the DOL website, search around on Google and figure out how to do it. And they send a free complaint to DOL. And all of a sudden, literally within a couple of weeks, sometimes you have an investigator showing up at your doorstep, usually unannounced to the employer, saying, hey, I'm so-and-so. Here's my ID from the Department of Labor. I'm going to need these things. And they slap down an example of all the records they want. And again, it's everything. It's everybody. Let's go back to that custodian case. I want time records, not just for this person, but I want everybody in that job category for your whole system or in this whole employer for at least 2 years back, if not 3. And they're going to look at everything, timesheets, job descriptions, anything you can name. It is a thorough review. And at the end of that investigator's got a lot of discretion to come in and say, okay, here's our decision. You owe us $500,000 with penalties and fines and everything else. How do you want to pay that? We take cash or card. And it really is a scary process.
Thank you, Chris. Sarah, do you have anything else to add? Any examples of penalties or any experience as you've worked with DOL for audits or anything?
And I'm just going to agree with everything Chris said. One thing I do want to highlight, especially for my small to medium-sized businesses, because I've seen it in too many handbooks. You mentioned the situation of, telling employees that they can't talk about salary. I have actually seen that in employee handbooks that you cannot discuss salary. We must take that out of our handbooks. And because that's something that we can't communicate that. So, but in terms of, the DOL audits, and this is kind of going down a different rabbit trail. Most of the ones that I have worked with clients on have been initiated because of independent contractor misclassifications. I see that quite a bit with the businesses that I've served, which opens the door, as Chris mentioned. They're not just looking at that, and so when I've done, just HR audits, general HR audits, that's one thing that I talk about, is the Pandora's box, so to speak, and employee files and the importance of only, keeping what you need to keep and, being very diligent about having documentation and things like that. But, again, it's the inconsistencies that they're looking for in whatever, files that are presented to them. And so, we've kind of touched on this already. So if you've got people in the same job category, but they're classified differently, they're going to ask why. And like I said, for me, it's primarily in the independent contractor thing. You've got someone that's working as, in marketing, that's a W-2 employee. And then, oh, well, we have this person over here that's 1099. Wow, what's the difference? And things like that. So again, not trying to go on that rabbit trail, but that's another thing. Maybe another call that we need to have through the chamber. But yeah, just agreeing with Chris. Yeah, once the door gets opened, you're subject to whatever they ask for, and you've got to provide it to them. And just saying I didn't know is not adequate defense. So I'll leave it at that. I'll let Julie add on anything she would like to.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Julie?
I am happy and pleased to say that I do not have experience with that, and I would like to keep it that way. And I know who to call if I need help. So I'm going to knock on wood.
Yep. I've got wood next to me, Julie. I just knocked on that for you.
I need that, Chris. I appreciate that support. So yeah, I'd like to. No, I can't help you in that regard.
I am glad to hear that. Thank you, Julie. Okay, so our next question. Let's talk a little bit more about those real challenging facets to this role. What does it look like? We've touched on this just a little bit. What does this look like in these remote and flexible environments? I could imagine that this is difficult. Chris, you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, and this is, again, I'm going to sound like the old guy with the gray hair, but that's just literally who I am now, so I have to own it. I mean, this is where the generational thing to me has become such a hard thing, because so many younger people, and I get it, want remote work, and not just young people. I mean, I think a lot of people want those remote work options, or at least flex work options. The problem is, and we just talked about it, but if you move that person to non-exempt and now they're hourly, you're really going to have to start monitoring when they're working at home, which is, like sometimes like a bring your own device policy becomes a huge issue because you're letting them use their personal computer, and just it's an honor system of, hey, you're getting your work done. That's great. But now I need to track it. I need to know when you're logging on, when you're logging off. And those log on, log off times, those clock in, clock out times are going to be something that has to match, right? I mean, if you're telling me as a white collar worker, you're getting on and working and you're filling your timesheets in to say that, but then if I go back and look in our VPN system, I'm sure that sounded dumb to IT people, by the way. I don't know what I'm talking about. But if I go back and look at like when you got into the VPN and it's only 4 hours and your timesheet say 8, we got real problems. I mean, it is a tough thing to get people to understand that those hours are now going to matter.
Thank you. Julie, did you have any remote or flexible workers?
We do. COVID helped us to leap into that world probably faster than most healthcare organizations would. I think that the manager having frequent conversations with those team members about the importance of timekeeping and the accuracy, and reminding people that you do not want them working you don't want them working off the clock. You want to make sure they record those hours and that the hours are recorded properly. I think just continually communicating that is important, similar to what that was just mentioned previously about the breaks. That's something, we are a very busy hospital, and sometimes it's hard to take a break because you're taking care of a patient. And we have to stress that with our managers and also with our team members, because we want them to take a break. They need to take breaks. And I think that it just goes back to continually whether you're having huddles, team meetings, one-on-ones, to let people know about what the expectation is, and just continually reinforcing that and monitoring that. You should inspect what you expect. And so you should periodically look at those time records and have those conversations before it becomes a big problem, before it becomes where Chris was just talking about, you get IT records looking at the VPN. I think that you just clearly state those expectations to people, but you have to do it continually. You can't just do it one time. You need to let people know that, so that clearly you set the culture and the expectations for them.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, Sarah, do you have anything to add to that?
Just reiteration, it's your managers that are going to help with this, because it's a lot of times it's a cultural thing, or what has, been created over time. So they're going to have to relearn, and they're going to have to monitor. But also technology can be your friend here too. As Chris, and again, I'm not IT either. So, and I do not know all the options that are out there, but they have definitely come a long way, because there's so many remote workers out there now, with technologies, like he said, every time they log in, like you can have, a holistic system that anytime they log in and access their email or the messaging platform or whatnot, that's being tracked, and that time's kind of automatically, accounted for, so to speak. So, I think those are the two biggies for making sure that we keep an eye on these things.
Hey, Lauren, can I add one thing real quick? Because it's a common, and I call it a nonsensical part of the FLSA. But don't forget, and Julie hit on something really important a second ago too, which is you got to make sure everybody knows what the policies are, and that you're logging in, and that you're not supposed to log in, for example, outside of work hours, because you're not approved for that overtime. And that's 100%. I'm on 100% on page on that. But don't forget too, as the employer, one thing employers will do, a huge mistake sometimes, is they'll say, oh, well, you logged in and did 2 hours at 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at night. Therefore, we're not going to pay you for that, because you didn't have authority to do it. You saw Julie's face and you saw Sarah's. As we know, that's a big no-no. If they log in and do it, even if it was against policy, you have to pay them. Any time worked under federal law has to be paid. You literally just have to essentially discipline them for doing it, but there's no way to sort of hold that money back. And that is one thing that I see a lot of employers sort of assume, oh, you violated policy, I can do that. You cannot do that.
Chris, while you're in that vein, why don't you talk about comp time too, because that comes up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So comp time is, and I see you guys can tell there's all kinds of pet peeves that lawyers have, just like you two. HR and lawyers, we have all kinds of pet peeves. A lot of people assume you can use comp time. Always remember, comp time only applies for certain public employees. And comp time is basically that for certain public employers, usually local and state employees, you can utilize essentially time off at time and a half for every hour worked over 40, right? And so that's where Sarah's getting. But a lot of people, especially in the nonprofit world, assume that comp time applies to them. It does not. A lot of people in private, if you're doing comp time as a private sector employer, I'll go ahead and tell you, don't tell anybody that. Just go ahead and change your policy, because you're violating the law. You can't do it. Okay. The only other thing I'd say about comp time for my public employers out there is it's a great way to do it. Remember, it's capped at 240 hours unless you're like an EMT or a police officer. And the other thing about comp time that is a big mistake is that employers will say, oh, well, I'm going to give you comp time, but I'm going to tell you when you can use it. That's not how the law works. The law works that comp time employee, if you say, hey, I'm going to let you take time off under comp time instead of giving you time and a half monetarily, that employee, unless you have a really good reason not to let them, gets to decide when to use that comp time and cash it in. It's really their ability to use it. You'd have to defend not being able to give it to them.
Sarah, thank you for mentioning that. Chris, thank you for that answer. Real briefly, something that I can't remember, Chris, if you'll answer this for me, the salary threshold, is there any benefits that are included in that threshold in what an employer pays for insurance, PTO, anything like that, does that add to that salary number, or is it just
Oh, no,
take
not
home before
typically. No,
taxes?
it's usually cash. It can, now I always hesitate to say this next part. It can include commissions, but that is really dangerous for non-exempt employees. You're going to see almost every employment lawyer gets like the shingles thinking about, I don't know why I said the shingles. It's like if I say the Kroger, but anyway, I'm gonna move on from that. But literally we get shingles thinking about somebody using commission to calculate that because it's just dangerous. Like, is it guaranteed commission? Are they always getting it? Because DOL will look at that and say, well, wait a minute, if half the time they're at $500 a week and you're giving them commission guaranteed, then you're violating the law. So yes, Lauren, the answer is under some stuff, usually commission or bonuses, but I'm really suspect and always gun shy about using that to get you over those thresholds.
Thank you, Chris. And we know you're an East Tennessee boy, so we know sometimes we just put the in front of things. It's fun. Okay, so last question. One of the main things that I work on here at the Chamber is talent retention and attraction. So that could be for a specific business or the community as a whole. So I'm interested to hear if you all are thinking through that piece as you are working on some of these changes. Are there things that you plan on doing to attract talent that are going to be below that threshold to make sure they understand that they are still, there's no demotion there, so to speak. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Julie, Sarah?
I was just going to say that probably anybody that's tried to hire anyone in the last 5 years or so can probably agree that hiring has been challenging anyway. And a lot of that has been around salary or has involved salaries anyway. So a lot of employers that I know of have already been looking at that and boosting salaries and things like that just to attract, the right candidates or whatnot. I'm not sure that it comes into play as much, this particular thing for someone that's looking for a job. I definitely think it has more of an impact on the people that are already within the company. When people are looking for a job, they kind of, let's be honest, most job postings don't even have the job category on there. They may have salary because it's almost, required now before anybody will even put their resume out there. But, so that's not something I don't think that even really gets brought up probably until after they're hired. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that, it's not usually a part of the interview process. And I've never had a candidate ask that question. Is this position exempt or non-exempt in the interview or anything like that? So I haven't seen it necessarily been an impact on that, the recruiting side, but definitely, obviously, retention, as we've already talked about those things.
Yeah, no, Sarah, I would agree with you. Julie?
Yeah, I think I've only had someone ask me just a handful of times if a position is exempt or not exempt. It doesn't really come up, but I would say that for healthcare specifically, keeping up with salaries and keeping your finger on the pulse, it's blocking and tackling because it's such a volatile market, and especially on the clinician side of things, is that you have to have a good tool to be able to keep up with that information so that you know that you have the most recent information. So today on November the 11th, you may not be able to use information that you had in February because it's going to be stale, it's going to be outdated. So from a recruitment and retention standpoint, you just need to keep your finger on the pulse of what is the market salary information and have as many tools available to you that you can use so that you are attracting people. But I agree with Sarah. I don't necessarily think this one thing is going to have as big of an impact as opposed to, are you paying the market? Are you paying the wage that's going to be able to attract that particular occupation to your organization?
Yeah, thank you. Chris, if you have anything else to add, but additionally, when in the hiring process, do you have to make sure that is communicated and understood? And is there any paperwork? Is there a checkbox somewhere that the new employee understands that they are exempt or not exempt?
I don't necessarily know if you have to, it has to be part of the verbal conversation as much, if that makes sense. I mean, I think it goes back to that job description. People are going to get tired of me saying those two words today. I always recommend put it as part of your job description. And that job description should be attached to the ad on Indeed or whatever site you use. And at the top right corner or something, which is a good way for the employee or the candidate to see it, but it's also a good way internally for you guys to track it, right? I mean, if you don't have an advanced software, if you're not using an HR platform, which a lot of people just can't, then that's a good way internally to kind of keep up with, okay, who's exempt, who's not. It's not only just for the employee to see it or the candidate, but for us to always remember, oh yeah, this is one of my exempt categories, and make sure that you just have, again, I literally recommend just having a box somewhere on it or just some area of the job description that just identifies which one they are.
Yeah, that's how we do things here on the job description. There is a checkbox, and then it's signed by the employee and the supervisor. So glad to know that we are doing that correctly. Okay,
can I add to that real quick? Sorry, kind of a thing that I've run into too, and kind of going into it relates to this, in that a lot of employers will use an offer letter. And so a lot of times if it's getting out there, it's through offer letter. It says this position's exempt, non-exempt. It'll have, details about the salary. And that's what I want to draw attention to. And Chris can add in on that too, about, not quoting that salary on an annual basis, or if you do, having that in parentheses of what the breakdown is. Like, so if you pay weekly, you can have the weekly breakdown, or monthly, or something like that. And because there have been situations, and again, Chris can weigh in on that, but where an employee kind of claims this as a contract, and they were terminated and said, well, you here in the offer letter, you said you're going to give me $50,000. I want my $50,000. Versus you could, the converse of that is, if you've broken it down into a smaller chunk, you would only be on the hook for X, Y, Z. But of course, your offer letter should have some type of an at-will disclaimer on there too, to help prevent it from looking like a contract. And this all conversations that we could have a whole nother HR and employment law conversation about the nuances of what to say, not versus what not to say. And things like that. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to talk about, the quotation of the salary too, how that can create potentially some issues too.
Yeah, I'll just say something real quick, and Sarah said it, but it's so anytime we talk about offer letters, you can see lawyers start to get nervous, because if you don't have an at-will disclaimer in that offer letter, and you're having both the employer and the new candidate sign it, that is a contract. Like, if you're putting the term, how long they're working, what the job is, what the money is, and you don't have something in there indicating, A, this is not a contract expressly, and B, that this is at will, then you have just created a contract. And I can't tell you the number of employers I've had that don't realize they're doing that. And then obviously what we're getting at there, and Sarah's right, this goes into somewhere else. It is a lot harder to change somebody's salary and to terminate somebody if you got them under contract versus at will. So please, please, please make sure that language is in there.
Thank you. That was a great point. Chris, Julie, Sarah, thank you so much for your insights today. We already have some great questions in the Q&A. For our attendees, please go ahead and put any questions that you have in the Q&A so we can get to them. But I want to start off with our first question. So when this rule was first being discussed, as we mentioned back in 2015, 2016, I was a supervisor. And so I was thinking through what this looked like. And one question that I had is, what if your supervisor tells you that you can leave early? But when we do that, if we say there's nothing going on, why don't you go ahead and leave at 4? We are wanting to gift them that hour. But what does that look like under this rule? If they're tracking time, what does that look like, Chris?
Yeah, so my answer is going to be kind of the same, but for public employers, it's really important not to do that. It's important not to do that, period. But for public employers, that can literally be a comptroller finding. I mean, literally, you can have whether you're a federal employee, state employee, local employee, that's fraud. That's literally taking taxpayer money, and that supervisor does not have the authority to basically say, hey, I know you clocked in for 8 hours today. I'm going to only make you work 4. That's the equivalent in a small way of creating a ghost employee, right? And we've seen so many cases over the years with corruption, and I'm not going to get into places where those things come into play. So you 100% as a public employer cannot do that. As a private employer, it's similar too. I mean, that supervisor does not control the money. They don't have the authority to say, hey, I'm going to pay somebody today for time they didn't work, unless that's authorized. Now, if you've got paid holidays and things like that in your handbook that says, hey, even if you're hourly, we're going to give you double time today, or we're going to pay you whether you're off, that's great. But that's a company decision. That individual supervisor does not have the authority to do that. And they would be in, if you call me, they're going to be in some pretty big trouble about that.
Thank you. Sarah, Julie, do either of you have any input on that?
I don't have anything else to add on that one.
Thanks, Julie.
I mean, I think, Chris, I'm just trying to make sure people understand. So like for exempt employee is one thing, right? And Lauren, maybe what you're getting at is a non-exempt's another. So they need to clock out when they're actually leaving, just to make sure that we're black and white about that. Because, or, I guess in certain circumstances, if that manager got approval from whomever on up the chain, hey, in this situation, can I give this person an hour of PTO? But some way that hour's got to be accounted for. Someone's got to sign off on, basically. But they need to be clocking in and out when they're actually leaving. So it's not like they say, hey, you can leave an hour early and I'll clock out for you. I can see how many problems that could create. So anyway, I just kind of want to talk that through a little bit.
And can I add something to that? I'm totally glad Sarah pointed that out, because I was referring to non-exempt. I'm glad you pointed that out. But the other thing I would add to that is a forgotten area of the FLSA, which Julie and Sarah know, and I know, is if you have an exempt employee, if they work at all that day, DOL says they're supposed to be paid as if it's a full day. That's one of the trade-offs to being exempt is, you don't get overtime, but if you work at all, you're supposed to be paid for the entire day. And I see a lot of employers mess that up and count them off for a half a day or all those other things. I mean, the flexibility is baked in a good way for those employees as well.
No, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted everyone to understand. I appreciate it. So our first question, Noah Jones has a great question, and he's with a nonprofit. His question is, there's been some back and forth on the language concerning nonprofits, with the most recent coming October 1st. This seems to have gone back to nonprofits have to have an annual $500,000 in commercial revenue, not assets, before this applies. Is it likely that January 1st will roll around with earned revenue still being the determining factor? Anybody want to answer that?
I'm going to be honest, and I'm always going to tell you as a lawyer, if I don't know it, I'll tell you. I do not know the answer to that. That one's not come up for me, so I don't want to sit here and go on the record and give you a specific answer on one that I just don't know the answer to.
Thank you, Julie.
Same here. I didn't know that particular part of the law, so that's news to me.
Okay, Sarah, have you heard anything? No,
I'm not going to touch that one either.
Okay.
We'll roll all those questions to Chris when they come up.
No, I'm sorry that we don't know. If we find out, we will let you know. Okay, our next question, which I think has a great question in this. When do you suggest communicating to team members? I think we've talked about that a little bit, as soon as possible, planting those seeds, but feel free to answer that. But with the change in administration, do we think the salary threshold will change? Do we think this rule will hold? I believe that was a little part of why this didn't go through back in 2016 and everything, if I'm remembering correctly. So who wants to answer those questions? Come on, Chris. I know you're like, I just don't want to answer every question, but you feel free.
Yeah, I talk too much, as my wife would say, and she's right. What I would say there is what's tough. I'm not dodging it, because I'll definitely give an answer. It's tough with the timing. Like that's why we're all, I think, struggling with it. Is January 1 is when this becomes effective. So we all know President Biden's still the president January 1. Elected President Trump, whatever we call there, doesn't come into office until late January. Now he would have the power to roll this back. Do I think that's going to happen? That's a really tough thing to ask employers, to make these changes and then all of a sudden go backwards. I don't think so. That's my prediction. I mean, they really stuck to their guns here more than they have previously. And I could see that basically they just say, okay, it's already been, Band-Aid's already ripped off. We're just going to keep it there. One thing I think you could see, and I could be wrong with my prediction, is another part of this rule that's baked in is that now DOL has basically said that we're not going to come back and do this again. it's going to automatically raise every little while based on inflation and other factors. I could see the Trump administration saying, no, we're going to put the kibosh on that. And we're not going to have employers having to do this again in 6 months, a year, 2 years.
I agree with Chris. I think that we're here at the 11th hour, and I don't see that happening. But I do agree with him about perhaps the inflationary increases could be rolled back. But we're moving forward like it's going to happen.
Yeah, thank you. And the when to communicate piece, y'all agree as soon as possible, planting seeds now? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Is telling employees, hang on just a second, my question went away. Is telling employees not to discuss their wages a federal law, or does it vary by state? Chris?
Federal. It's under the National Labor Relations Act. It can get a little complicated if you're talking about public employees, but typically you could get me on a whole First Amendment issue as well. So, I just tell people generally, you just can't do it. You can't prohibit it. It for private employers for 100%, it's under the NLRA.
Thank you.
Can I play devil's advocate with that real quick?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
And because this is questions that I've gotten, because people really, employers really want to die on that hill, honestly. And so, so the question I was asked is, well, how can I at least minimize it? So can you talk about, well, is there a caveat of behaviors that are disruptive to work operations? Or the NLRA is sticky, so I don't know. You get where I'm going with that?
Yeah, it's tough. And I totally get where you're going with it. Obviously, if somebody's being disrupted at work during clocked hours, I think that's different. You can always limit communications. If somebody's supposed to be working and they're literally getting paid for it, you can always limit that. What's tough is employers have to understand that if somebody's on a break, if somebody's at lunch, if somebody's on the team bowling, the company bowling team on a Friday night, salary and what you get paid is part of working conditions. And I know you know that, Sarah, and Julie knows it, but man, the feds are really broad on what a working condition is, and they're really bad about if you try to quash that. So it's a little bit of a tightrope, but yeah, if it's working hours and people are just holding meetings when they're supposed to be, working on spreadsheets, that's different. You definitely have some options there.
Thank you so much. So our last question, we talked about this a little bit. We talked about it last time. This is a hard one. So our company employs sales managers with a base salary who are also paid a commission. Do we need to bump them to meet the new minimum? So that base salary, is it safer to have the base salary at that threshold? Is it okay to say they make an average of $5,000 in commission, which will get them to that salary, so I'm going to let that ride? What do you think? Go ahead, Chris.
And I feel bad. So my answer to that is, I'm not saying you can't do it. And DOL says you can do it. What I recommend, though, to be safer is to instead do a all or nothing commission structure, do a guaranteed commission as a floor, and then it can go up. So, for example, if I've got somebody that, let's say per week, is got a base salary of $700, but I know that they average commission way more than that. They're at $900, $1,000 a week if I add commission. Then let's just give them a floor for commission that they're going to get a guaranteed commission of X that can go up to Y, right? Because then with base plus commission, I just talk with my hands. With base plus commission, you've already got them there, and it's guaranteed. What DOL is not going to want to see is that there are lots of weeks in which they're way below that because you're not giving them some sort of guaranteed pay.
That's a great suggestion. Okay, well, we are right at time. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Special thank you to Julie, Chris, and Sarah. You all are a wealth of knowledge, and we really appreciate y'all being in the community and helping us answer these questions. Before we wrap up, I want to say one more thank you to our regional enhancement partners, Cirrus Aircraft, and our talent ecosystem partners, Accenture, RIMEX, and Y12 Federal Credit Union. This program has been recorded, so a link to the recording and any follow-up resources will be sent later this week, and it will be posted as a resource on our website, higherupknox.com. which is where we have all of our workforce development resources. And we're also hosting 2 more virtual discussions before the new year. The first is a focus on AI and automation and how these technologies can transform our workforce. And the second will be a business succession planning panel. You can register for both of those under the events tab at our chamber website, knoxvillechamber.com. Thanks again, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful Monday.
Thank y'all. Good